curando toda maleza, curando, curandera, curando, y sacando toda impureza.
In the words of Eduardo Duran, Oakland's own native scholar and author of the post-colonial psychology framework, I will offer a different approach to analysis in a manner that moves closer to indigenous oral traditional methodologies. I selected an autoethnographic lens to frame my process as an artist, scholar, and therapist in training to connect to the wider cultural, political, and social experience of post-colonial historical trauma within the Native community. My main goal in this presentation is to provide clinical awareness of the importance of processing historical trauma and the value of incorporating indigenous expressive art practices while clinically engaging with this population. A few years ago, after earning a master's in media for social justice in Los Angeles, I moved to the Lake Merritt neighborhood in the Bay Area of Northern California. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, it's been Oakland's little Central Park since 1870 and was made a historic landmark in 1963, making it the U.S.'s first official wildlife refuge. On my first walk in the neighborhood, I noticed these small land acknowledgments and signs of colonial resistance that made me feel like I was in community really for the first time. Little thought is given to the original people of this land. A recent demographic study concluded that the size of pre-Columbian indigenous populations reached 60 million. Now, to give you some comparison, Europe's population in 1492 was estimated to be between 70 and 88 million, and it was spread over less than half of the area. Let's dive a little deeper into the psychology behind colonialism and Columbus's first interaction with the native people. As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and give me the information of whatever there is in these parts. In 2018, researchers stated, a more recent and provocative claim is that the experience of trauma, or more accurately, the effect of that experience, is passed somehow from one generation to the next through non-genomic, possibly epigenetic mechanisms affecting DNA function or gene transcription. Indigenous scholar, grief and trauma expert Maria Yellowhurst Braveheart coined the term historical trauma in the 1980s, and went on to develop the historical trauma and unresolved grief framework. A contemporary of Braveheart's, Dr. Ruby Gibson, took this research and created an intervention she calls somatic archaeology. And I'm going to let her define historical trauma for us and tell you what holding this trauma does to a person and their descendants over time.
Historical trauma is an accumulation of events that begins to manifest in future generations, meaning that the events of the past become embodied in present-day populations, and that embodiment is difficult to process because it doesn't belong to the people of this generation. But there's difficulty making that distinction. Historical trauma can include loss of lands, loss of culture, loss of family. Historical trauma most often happens when we forget or we develop historical amnesia.
A new study finds the people of pre-colonial Puerto Rico did not disappear entirely as previously believed. Historians believed the indigenous tribe called the Taínos were completely eradicated after Europeans arrived to the island during the 15th century. But now that's not the case. Researchers have found 3 genomes from ancient skeletons living in the DNA strands of living Puerto Ricans.
Upon reaching our shores, the conquistadores immediately began massacring all the Taínos. No more than 500 elders and young people fled to the inner island cave system, entering out just outside San Juan to escape peril. The Spanish remained in hot pursuit, but my ancestors managed to lose them because in the end the conquistadores would not risk the dangers of the dark, wet interior island cave system. Time passed while we remained in the caves for safety, and many died. The dangers of the cavernous wildlife caused our numbers to dwindle down to about 40 by the time we settled in the area now known as Sidra. Eventually, we were colonized and intermarried with the conquistadores for survival, like many Taino families. And even though our traditions were taken from us, my family continues to live close to the land. As a practicum intern, and discovered firsthand why we have historically utilized the expressive arts for therapeutic reasons in the indigenous community, and was guided by a useful piece of information, some research by Dr. Joseph Gahn, Harvard professor and anthropologist. He wrote about treating historical trauma in this community. Multicultural advocates within professional psychology routinely call for culturally competent counseling interventions. So with that in mind, I turned to the power of Native American expressive arts and discovered that they are therapeutically beneficial because they help build rapport with clients, keep our indigenous traditions alive, strengthen the intertribal relationship with clients. Some of the expressive art therapists that I found to be particularly beneficial were beading, rock painting, dancing, singing, drumming, ancestral altar creation, smudging, song, music, storytelling, creative writing, and poetry. Building upon the traditional indigenous use of crystals, I experimented and discovered that crystal singing bowls are extremely useful in the therapeutic environment. In my practicum work with children between the ages of 2 and 15, I turned to games and non-directive play to break the ice and build the therapeutic relationship. Through sportsmanship, I was able to culturally align with clients and access the warrior archetype. This was useful in beginning to introduce a historical trauma framework in sessions. During my internship, I discovered that there is a huge need for more psychoeducational teaching materials, including curriculums, workbooks, journals, games, and decks. As you can imagine, there's also a great need for more expressive art therapists that are indigenous to serve this population. Equally important is more scholarship on the relevance of culturally centered expressive art in treating this demographic. I will leave you with a brief public service announcement for our allies. Cultural appropriation is the acknowledgement or inappropriate adaptation of the customs and practices by one culture by members of a dominant culture. So be sure to always give credit where credit is due. Don't let cultural appropriation happen to you. Education and respect are key to working with this population in a therapeutic environment to overcoming centuries of trauma caused by inhumane medical practices on indigenous people. So expect some resistance and plan for it. Eduardo Duran's book, Healing the Soul Wound, is a really useful guide in breaking down how to create a culturally specific therapeutic safe space. Equally important is reconnecting and healing your own ancestral roots and generational trauma. Some tools for discovering your own personal ancestry are Ancestry DNA, Somos, and African Ancestry. Finally, don't be afraid to do research, ask questions respectfully, and use local native resources, as well as utilizing culturally specific expressive art therapy modules. To learn more, you can reach me at the following. Thank you for joining me for this special presentation of Ancestral Healing from the Inside Out. I'm your host, Kiki Lyons. Bawatukan. Blessings and good health to you all.
Si pari, los toda la potencia de mi madre tierra. Me pegué fuerte, me pegué adentro. Cúrame para que te dé vida siempre. Vamos rompiendo las cadenas de la mente. La Pachamama lo siente. Dale hasta abajo, curandera presente. Yo tengo el canal abierto, estoy ardiente. Tengo la sangre que me hierve bien caliente. Es la combinación tan excelente. La Miss Bolivia volando con palomas se enciende. Pachamama, ay curando, curandera curando.